Thanks, Chris, and thank you all for your invitation to chat with you. I hope to use all the energy we gathered at lunch from both the meal, which was great, and the sun, that gives us a bit of boost of energy, but I also want to tap into Carlos's energy and the challenge that he posed for us in terms of showing a more evidence-based, fact-based approach to what we are talking about. And I think there's a definite importance to the regional stories and the regional approaches to looking at innovation, entrepreneurship. But I really want to also just step back and follow on Annalie's presentation and also Daniel's presentation later on, and start to look at some of the data that comes in through the door. When we ask executives, where do your best ideas, your most innovative ideas come from? And from a monitor's point of view, I've seen those ideas come both from internal operations of the company, various divisions in the company, but equally important is the business environment, what occurs outside the control of these CEOs, outside of the control of these companies. They're very advanced suppliers. They're very advanced educational institutions that offer very specialized programs that speak the language of the customer, in this case, the companies in a region. And there's a lot of confusion about innovation, industry clusters out there. Lots of governments like to say they're very competitive. Our approach is that only firms are competitive, not regions or countries. If you have evidence of a lot of firms that are competitive and that are listed as being very competitive in your region, then you can claim to have a competitive business environment. With that in mind, there's also quite a lot of a gap, both in terms when you ask executives, yes, we all believe in innovation as an important driver of productivity gains and of revenues and of prosperity, both for employees and for the residents of a community. There's quite a lot of a gap in terms of whether they're getting that kind of innovation in the regions where they locate their investments. More troubling also is they're not aware very much of what is going on in their regions. They made these huge investments, and yet there's a certain gap in terms of the knowledge about what is actually occurring in this ecosystem, both from an innovation perspective, company operations perspective. So it's very important to start to basically drill deeper into this information gap and innovation gap. I'm just going to tell you very quickly about two projects that I've been personally involved with. One's the Clusters of Innovation Initiative that occurred about 10 years ago in the United States, sponsored by the Council on Competitiveness, which is basically set up to help address the challenge of competitiveness for US companies and US leaders. And that project set up an investigation in which Michael Porter was involved, one of our co-founders, in which we looked at the drivers of innovation in various regions in the United States and try to unwind some of those regional experiences in terms of how to create an innovative environment. It also created a new approach to dealing with this topic of innovation from both a business perspective and a government perspective by throwing away and really discarding this old model of government-driven innovation strategy and proposing a new approach and actually embodying it and operationalizing it in the project, in which you took some of the key leaders, in this case the United States, in terms of the educational leaders, the company leaders, and also some of the great regional perspectives on innovation, and tried to really look at what was happening and what was driving certain regions to claim success in attracting innovative developments. So here's just some of that data, and this was data that we started collecting 10 years ago and that we've added to every project that we do now, where we look at this question of, if you agree with the statement that innovation is a good place and you're getting a lot of it in your region, what else is happening? What else is true? What other policies are in place for that region that are helping you achieve this kind of innovation? And interestingly is this relationship between the innovators, the scientists, the researchers, the company executives that make the locational decision, and their counterparts in government. The ability of those two worlds to meet and actually have a meaningful, productive conversation is actually rated by these executives. There's over 3,000 respondents to these questions. It's making them say, yeah, I actually was able to find an innovative environment in which to operate because of that conversation. when we talk about tax incentives, it's specifically tax incentives revolving around R&D and commercialization of R&D. The viability of ideas in the marketplace, they'd rather get a tax break there than other types of tax breaks because it's also able to prove the concept that they're trying to sell. But certainly they go back, it all goes back to this relationship between government and business, how closely aligned their interests are, how much coordination occurs, and how much of a university industry networking occurs as well. Just one example, because of the time limits, is this concept of the ability of a government, regional government, because we believe that the region is the geographic footprint, the relevant geographic footprint for innovation, not the national footprint, because of the variability in innovation and the ability to actually implement specific programs at a national level becomes a lot more complicated. There are, of course, topics related to innovation that only happen at the national level, IP protection laws and that sort of thing. But certainly when we get down to the actual Monday morning, how do we implement this, we actually have to get it back down to the regional level. There's an example in North Carolina of what was achieved through many years, over 60 years of conversations between government leaders there and industry in basically creating the conditions for industry to basically find a place in which to innovate. The economy in North Carolina in the 1950s was basically 50% agriculture-based, very much tobacco, very traditional economy. And over the years, through very concerted investments in educational assets, that were investments that were informed by these conversations they had with industry. So they would go to IBM initially, GlaxoSmithKline, other companies, and they would say, what kind of skill sets do you need for your future employees? Not the ones you have now, but the ones you're going to need in about 2 to 3 years, so that by the time they graduate from our programs, they're actually going to have the types of skills that you are going to need. And they started this conversation, and lo and behold, this is more recent data, North Carolina now has the highest percentage of actual corporate R&D investment in the US. This very tight relationship between the ability to actually translate the needs of business in a meaningful way into the educational assets in a region, and so that the pipeline of talent that goes out that door stays in the region instead of going to Boston or going to California. There's some learnings around this, and we did a very substantial piece of work, but I'm going to just sort of give you the highlights, is this idea of specialized conversations around the key assets in a region. When Biogen IDEX hiring manager in Research Triangle goes to talk to their counterparts in North Carolina State University and North Carolina State and Duke University, there's a very specific conversation. They can find that person easily in both government, in both the state universities, but also Duke University, and they can translate that into the needs of the company. The close proximity, that was mentioned a number of times. We're big believers in that, and we're big believers in Tim's approach to incubators, and not just as the physical building and the subsidies, but really just getting people together to speak a similar language and making sure that they get the ability to be together and bring in experts from the outside. One of the best examples of this is in San Diego, which up until the 1950s, 60s was a resort community. It was very much sort of leisure, travel and leisure, it's sort of escaping the cold weather. But they had a very sophisticated customer there because of the decision that Theodore Roosevelt made back at the turn of the century, which was to set up a naval base. And at the time, the Navy was a big consumer of wireless communication. And instead of making and tinkering with the wireless communication in Washington, D.C., which was the point of decision, the point of purchase was in Washington, the Pentagon, Irvin Jacobs, who went on to found Qualcomm, actually said, no, I have to actually use this closeness to tinker with my, the wireless communication in San Diego with my customers here because the ships are here. We need to do it here. And it created a program, and the regional leadership at the time actually saw this happening and had very close communication with Irvin Jacobs and others in the industry and said, we really have to step up our game in terms of the educational investments that we're going to need. And University of California, San Diego made very conservative, specific investments in telecom-related educational programs. And they created an incredible networking engine within the university called UC Connect. And we use it as a very important example of a totally volunteer, the lawyers from the San Diego community, both IP lawyers and traditional lawyers, the venture capital community, became very involved, volunteered their time, and became involved in this program, this UC Connect program. It eventually got funding from the state, and so that they could actually have a forum and a place to meet. But it was a way to establish these close bonds and to establish a peer review process in which entrepreneurs could vet their ideas and get advice from the leaders in their community and also from the mentor. I mean, I mentioned this idea of embedding philanthropy into the conversation of entrepreneurship and the importance of not just having, because we all suffer from siliconitis, of having other models in place. The anchor firm model is one model for entrepreneurship where you feed off the spin-offs that come out of a large company that's already in a region. Danfoss is a great example. We had Danfoss as a client. I worked in South Jutland, where they were very worried about leaving their traditional home, where they had been for a long time, and setting up operations in China and laying off a lot of people. Well, Jürgen Klaus had said, look, there might be an opportunity here for Danfoss to create an investment vehicle via this industry cluster entrepreneurship approach to actually benefit Danfoss, but also benefit the executives that are leaving my company that have these great ideas that I could never fund because they were sort of out of my core competency, but that eventually became very sophisticated suppliers to Danfoss and that stayed in the region. So that's the anchor firm model. And in San Diego, it's the local hero model. You saw it in what happened in Seattle with Bill Gates and creating the software industry there. There's many other approaches that work where you necessarily initially don't have to have MIT, Stanford, these huge institutions, but that you could also have another viable approach. Eventually, though, you will need to buttress your educational assets. You will need to invest in those to keep ahead of the game. Initially, the mentor model for developing an entrepreneurship culture only gets you so far, but it's certainly there's evidence to point that actually works in some places. And again, not thinking about political boundaries. We are all hostage to the political jurisdictions that we inherit from our forefathers, but nowadays innovation crosses borders. They're agnostic as to the political boundaries often, and we have to think about what the needs are. So if it means setting up a joint program with a neighboring country, a neighboring region, not to have a rejection of that idea, and really to explore the needs of the cluster in terms of industry cluster and the innovators to make that happen. Again, it's this idea towards bias towards action, to actually test driving and piloting a lot of these initiatives, much like an innovator would do. Some of them are not going to work, and some of them are going to potentially work in Silicon Valley or in California and Singapore, but not work here. You have to try them out, and you have to use a lot of this evidence that's been collected over time to actually help you along the way. Some of that evidence comes from entrepreneurs themselves. We went around and asked over 5,000 entrepreneurs in multiple countries, and in fact, in the Al Khalifa Fund helped us, disseminate the survey, and the Al Maktoum Foundation helped us disseminate the survey in the Middle East. We asked entrepreneurs, at the end of the day, what policies were in place that would help explain why you gravitate towards those entrepreneurship hotspots? What is it about the policies there that are different that makes you want to set up your company there, that makes you want to transform your operations to that location? And so we asked a survey of these entrepreneurs around multiple dimensions. Some of them are very well covered by other institutions. The World Bank Doing Business does a very good job of some of the administrative burdens and the support services. But there was this other part that was a little bit gray area, this sort of culture mindset issue that anecdotally shows up everywhere, but quantifiably was very difficult to get to the bottom of. So we did some statistical analysis that indicated that the importance of the mindset, the cultural mindset in a region, the ability to take on risks, the ability for society to see entrepreneurs as a viable career choice, the ability to cash out on the risk. So, the income taxes in the region, the ability to survive failure. We discussed sort of in Scandinavian society, the fear of bankruptcy was very much a driver towards inhibiting the creation of these businesses, because entrepreneurs would say, look, I'm going to have a problem with my family and the way they talk about me if I fail in my business. I'm just going to go to London, going to go to the U.S. to set up my business, where they see that as a badge of honor. And in fact, this happens in the US too. I did a project in New Jersey with the life science industry. Largest pharmaceutical employment in the United States is in New Jersey because of the headquarters of Pfizer and a bunch of other companies. And they had an issue with biotech. They just could not create enough biotech companies, even though they had all these executives with an incredible amount of training and skills. And so I asked one of the key, Princeton, New Jersey also happens to be a hotbed of VC capital. And I asked one of the partners there, what's the difference between your office here and the one in San Diego? And he said, very simple. The one here, the laid-off executive comes from pharma and says, you know, here's my curriculum. I'd like to get a job. Can you refer me? You have a great network. The same type of person in San Diego would come with a business plan. So, you know, this happens regionally. There's regional differences in the US as well about this. And it's all about these attitudes and what could be created. So critics often say, well, Pedro, that's great, but, you know, how do we actually do that from a policy perspective? How do we, you know, show me evidence of governments that have actually moved the needle in terms of changing cultural mindsets? And I often think of Korea. And we had Korea as part of this project, where as a result of the financial crisis, you know, there's nothing better than a crisis to make, you know, to move your feet. They were forced to have a solution for all these laid-off employees from the chaebols to have a viable, meaningful, productive career afterwards. And so they changed the actual tax laws around home-based businesses, for example. And they started to chip away at the cultural inhibitors towards having a family-owned business instead of working for the chaebols, which was seen as a very, very laudatory thing. And so they started to change it through the tax laws. They started looking around the world, looking at the US tax law in terms of home-based deductions for businesses. They started to create celebrity entrepreneurs. I mean, we often talk about how much attention the World Cup players get and the soccer players and how much money they actually get and how much society, how much airtime they have. Well, in places like Korea and certainly the US for a long time, it's been, they've been on equal footing a lot of times with some of the Hollywood celebrities. Trying to create the mythology around entrepreneurs then turns to be a very interesting way to start to chip away at some of the societal, viewpoints on entrepreneurship. And you can do that through, entrepreneurship contests. You can do that through programs where you create the story, you create the myths around entrepreneurs, and there's nothing better to really get a young person going than, having a mentor in that regard. I mentioned Danfoss and the ability to spin off companies and to spin off the talent and to energize that talent to new opportunities that are often complementary to the company that they came from. Changing the laws around spin-offs and the tax implications of spinning off companies is often seen as quite important. What the entrepreneurs told us was that setting up professionalized angel investor networks was much more meaningful to them than actual VC, than spending time on setting up VC networks. VC networks are important, for sure. They didn't say they weren't important, but they said if you actually had limited funds, try to help to professionalize the dialogue that occurs at the friends and family seed round, because I'm going to have a lot more. That's going to make it a lot more interesting for me to stay in that region if that's available. Let's see. Another thing that is quite important is what not to do and what things to look out for in terms of both the reaction of companies when they hear about these innovation initiatives at the national and regional level. Oftentimes their first reaction is, why would I want to help my competitors? Well, that's counterintuitively, that's actually a self-defeating prophecy, because the more competition you have in a region, the more options a student or someone that comes into the region as an employee has in terms of in case that business fails. In terms of a job opportunity, in case that business fails, there's 4 other companies in the region that I could equally find a home in. And that's actually good because of the churn that occurs naturally in these cases. The ability of you to help create the critical mass of a talent pool and the attractiveness of that in your region is going to depend on your ability to actually work with some of your competitors to create that important aspect. Another part of it is, the cash incentives that can only get you so far. They're oftentimes, the meaningfulness of that dies away quite quickly. There's also the mixed goals of different entities in a region. This often is one of the biggest problems when we advise public sector officials is, look, there's a lot of key constituents in your region. Some of them, due to the political makeup and the political animosity will want to go this way and the other one will want to go this way, you're going to need to have the business community there in the conversation to make sure that there's some alignment on shared goals that are going to be they're going to be the foundation of this innovation initiative. And that often means doing the assessment of the industries that should rise up to the occasion, not be selected by the government necessarily, but really have it be a very Darwinian process in which executives raise their hands and look, we're organized, we're ready, we want to make this happen, we have the energy and the vitality to do this, but we're going to need your help, the government, to set up some of these educational assets. And the analogy we often use is the private sector rows the boat, the government steers a bit. But really, it's the energy comes from the actual executives, the companies there that are trying to set up these businesses. And also not forgetting your traditional strengths. We're oftentimes, everybody's obsessed with having the next biotech center, having the next advanced materials center. Well, there's a lot of innovation in agriculture, textiles. I often look at Galicia, for example, with the prowess that it has and that it enjoys in the textile center, and not really taking advantage of that some more, and also getting its biggest innovator there, the founder of Inditex, to be part of that conversation, to be part of the economic strategy, the innovation strategy for that region. I think getting that to be part of the course of doing one of these innovation initiatives should be very much replicated throughout in other parts of the world. I'm going to leave this here so that we can, in case you want to reference it, but I'm open to questions. Love to hear any comments.